advocating for artificial intelligence. This is part of the discussion on Europe going digital, on the world going digital here at the European Business Summit. How do you develop artificial intelligence, AI, while ensuring ethics and human rights? How do you encourage that development and set ethical guidelines without killing the golden goose that is innovating? Or maybe that golden goose might go somewhere else. That's the key issue there too. So we want to talk to someone in the European Parliament and also a project, Sherpa. Project Sherpa is called Shaping the Ethical Dimensions of Smart Information Systems. Let's bring on the two guests, Eva Kaili, MEP of S&D, Socialists and Democrats. Eva, you are on the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age, termed called AIDA. And also with us is Bernd Stahl, who is Sherpa coordinator. Now, Sherpa stands for Shaping the Ethical Dimensions of Smart Information Systems. That was established in 2018. It includes academia, industry, civil society, standards bodies, and ethics committees, as Eva is on. So it's very interesting to get input from both of you, and knowing in the context that the European Parliament has approved a number of proposals that were proposed initially by Sherpa, and those include on liability, on property rights, on ethics, and then the European Commission is supposed to make its proposal early next year. So that is the process. That's what we're looking at right now, and it's good to have Sherpa and a member of that special committee in the Parliament to talk about this. Let me start with Eva. Eva, one of the proposals by Sherpa, and which you've taken up on in this special committee, is how to develop a regulatory framework and enforcement mechanisms for AI. How do you do that without killing the golden goose, as I said?
Thank you for having me and organizing this very interesting discussion. So the main problem of Europe is that at this point, we already have a fragmented regulatory landscape. So it has to happen in any case. So before we start being concerned about what happens next, first we have to set up the regulation that would take down the barriers between the European member states. And this is crucial because we need to fulfill a digital single market because companies that start up here, they usually find bigger markets like China and US, allowing for them access to data, or like one market with like one legal and tax system that would make it more easy for them to expand. So with the European Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, we are trying to address that during the legislative period that we are now going through, especially under the light of the pandemic. And we have several files coming up. Besides the initiatives and the opinions, we have legislative work that's coming up.
Right. You had a committee meeting last week. Can you give us any news on that? Any new developments out of that committee, the special committee?
So the AIDA, the special committee, is actually trying to coordinate our work and our common position as Europeans beyond parties and committees, because AI is too broad in order to be covered by one special committee. So what we try to do is like to set the roadmap, to understand the national strategies, and to be able to fill all the missing pieces. So we had some hearings already on different aspects that would be transformed in our lives, like the labor rights, the trade, and we will keep going like that until we cover any aspect that will be transformed in order to provide MEPs with like scientific data and understanding of how we should proceed with the legislation that's upcoming. And I'm also running a Center for AI, which is under the think tank of the European Parliament. And there we have already done several pieces of like research and studies and workshops. And I think we have quite developed our understanding on how we should proceed. And one of the things that we agreed also in the special committee is to collaborate globally. Let's say, first of all, with OECD.
Right.
in order to agree on stuff that actually could work beyond EU, not only inside the European Union.
Yeah, OECD being the major industrialized countries of the world. One other question before I go to Bernd is another proposal which I believe you support is establishing an agency, a European agency for AI. What would that do? And don't we have enough agencies?
Well, actually, we don't have in Europe is a body where we can coordinate and harmonize a bit the environment, so to provide clear understanding, clear to the European Parliament, the Commission for amendments that are necessary, but also that can be very close to the industry and explain the red lines and the restrictions, because AI is a technology that we cannot put it in one box. We have to have different approaches, low risk, high risk, and prepare security criteria for anything that's coming up. So it develops, and we still don't know where that line should be. So first we have to finish with the legislation. Then we have to be able to make to adapt and to be flexible. We have to be able to support and advise the institutions by having an independent authority actually that could like risk alert them, and they can set objective criteria that would apply beyond any member state borders. So to monitor that
right.
and also to promote where it's needed, to have basically, and this is not easy, and no, we don't have enough agencies to do that and independent authorities. I think AI is too big to let it go in the hands of the industry or the politicians.
Right, right. Okay, my apologies to the viewers that the connection with you is not exactly perfect, but we're going to continue. Let's talk about a few concrete issues regarding AI, because it's so hard to get your head around, really. And Bernd Stahl over at Sherpa, you are director of the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility at the University of Leicester, but you're also director of Sherpa, which is an EU-funded project. 5 issues here, 5 scenarios. Warfare, for instance, hackers disabling a power plant, inciting violence. Education, robots in the classrooms. Questions of privacy, of surveillance. Self-driving cars, about insurance, about movement tracking. Mimicking technologies, robots, holograms, deception. And predictive policing, discrimination, surveillance, privacy. The Minority Report, the Tom Cruise film, might come to mind on that. About a lot of issues. Can you tell us one in which, give us an example of how one of those should be regulated? Maybe we look at self-driving cars, for instance, which will be coming with IoT, with the Internet of Things, with 5G. These are issues that are going to become increasingly real for all Europeans. Bernd.
Okay, so the scenarios you've just mentioned, they are scenarios that we developed in the Sherpa project with a view to getting a feel for what AI and related technologies are likely going to look like in 3, 4, 5 years. So in the fairly short-term future. We've also looked at examples of cases which are already happening. So we've done current case studies. Now, as you suggested, there are lots of different issues that are worth exploring. So with regards to autonomous vehicles, for example, many of these have to do with safety and with liability.
Yeah.
So many of those are actually already well covered by current legislation around vehicles in general. So the question who's responsible for a malfunction of a car is one that will look slightly different in autonomous vehicles, but is one that is well-trodden territory in the law. And the work we're doing is trying to pinpoint where exactly new interventions are required, where current solutions are not sufficient. And that's what the recommendations are about.
Okay. Among one of those reports that the European Parliament approved was a proposal to limit liability to 10 million euros in the event of death and physical harm, and 2 million euros for damage to property. Eva, isn't that for some people that might not be enough? What do you think?
We still have not even worked on the legislation, so we're not ready to be that specific. So what we're trying to do is to explore where we should move and how we can have, it's very difficult to translate the rule of law and human rights respect
Yeah.
into the digital era. So this is what we're trying to believe, that we have to have transparency based, principle based legislation in order to get it right, because whatever is illegal online, it should be offline. Whatever is offline, it should be online. So liability is the same. So we need to have clear rules and understand, talk about more specific measures. And I think what we definitely need to make sure is that the applying a rule of law and also by design, it has to happen with a scientific and technical understanding of how the technology works throughout the whole life cycle of AI, and not when harm happens. So we have to have transparency, we have to have safety checks in order to avoid talking about specific fees. But I do believe we can have like a range of that. But the first time, like 2 years ago, that we spoke about liability, blame the vehicle. Well, this is not the case. You have to make sure it's going to be clear who is also citizens need to have clear access to what happened to the data and to how the algorithm work, how the vehicle worked. And what you mentioned before about insurance, deception, surveillance, and autonomous vehicles, this is exactly the high risk AI that we have to care about even more and have more strict rules.
Bente, what is the guidance that you've given as far as recommendations on liability for self-driving cars or anything else?
So we have not produced recommendations specifically on liability. In our recommendation around the development of a legislative framework, we did say that this is a topic that needs to be covered. I think with regards to what Eva just said, namely the question of risk assessment and categorization of risk, I think there are interesting questions to be asked, how fine-grained, how detailed that has to be. So in many of the current proposals, there's a distinction between high risk and low risk. And one of the questions we have is whether that is sufficient, whether, for example, physical safety issues are the only ones that need to be considered under high risk, or whether other risks should be treated in a similar way. So these are all discussions that are still ongoing. And I think the question of liability is a key one that will settle many of the ways in which we can deal with those technologies in future.
Eva, regarding what's called a design, ethics by design for researchers, that's one of the other recommendations by the STEM project, by the Sherpa project. What's your feeling on that, on setting that sort of guideline for researchers?
So we already did that, as I said again, 2 years ago. Now we have to make it definitely binding by law, because in Europe we don't need to let things be blurry. We know exactly what we want to protect. We don't want to have discrimination or exclusion from an insurance company using automated decisions. And it has to, I think the approach, we like the approach of the European Commission for law to enhance the enforcement of the law when you're moving into more high-risk applications. So I think it's a good idea to have ethics officers, basically to explain, and as we have a data protection officer, to be able to give clear guidelines for the enforcement also of GDPR. I think we have to understanding of how the technology. One of the interesting things that happened to me during my last design, how to create trust by design, ethics by design, and I had some people working in the industry telling me that these things are not possible. If you're a politician that don't understand the algorithms and the technical for AI, you believe that this is not possible. Well, it's actually possible to do it by design. What you have to make sure is that you don't try to fit everything in one box. You have different approaches for different applications in order to avoid stifling innovation. So I would agree with that. And I think having maybe we can merge and align and combine a role of having an AI ethics officer or
Uh-huh.
officers
Yeah.
with human rights officers or like officers for businesses and data protection.
So you think that that should be binding, that should be required of any company that
And
engages
that's
in AI?
what we're working with the city to set clear standards to be followed.
Yeah, yeah. Bernd, in your
Yes,
discussions,
but we can
yeah,
of course have different sets of requirements
yeah,
depending on the application.
indeed. Bernd, in your discussions within Sherpa, which includes industry and researchers as well, what's the feeling there? Can you expand on that, on this ethics by design? Because that's also been a consideration with bioethics too. With the genie out of the bottle, how do you regulate that? How do you get companies to regulate that?
Yes, so the idea behind ethics by design, and that is, of course, aligned with existing other types of by design, such as privacy by design, security by design. The idea there is to give people tools that would allow them to think about the relevant issues early on. So in the, just like we've known for a long time, if you try to bolt on security on a computer system after it's been developed, it typically doesn't work particularly well. Mm-hmm. So the earlier in the process of developing you embed these considerations, the better. And what's the problem at the moment is that it's not clear how best to do that. So it's not necessarily clear who should do it, at what stage of development should do it, and how it would integrate into existing methodologies of development. And ethics by design, as we propose it, would be a way that allows developers, that allows companies, but it allows individuals, it would also allow public sector bodies who are developing and trying to make use of AI to find ways to integrate ethical concerns within the methodologies they're already using.
Let's turn to education, one of the other scenarios that you have that Sherpa looked at. Robots in the classrooms, inequalities, surveillance, privacy, those are related issues there. And that's something that a lot of us are thinking about right now is during COVID, and a lot of people are doing home education. What is the proposal there to ensure that AI really does help students and avoids any privacy issues? Eva, do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, you know, we have already set up after a public discussion we had during the summer and under the light of the pandemic. So we are trying to. Europe doesn't have the full competency on the educational
That's
program
right.
of the European member states. What we're trying to do is to call to have AI assisted systems in Horizon Europe to make sure we will create actually by design the need to have AI training and guidelines for the Horizon Europe researchers and organizations. So I think basically we'll try to use more of the tools that we have to give more options and alternatives. I think one of the words that here it's very important for me is to give options. So anybody that wants to be able to understand AI to be able to do so, since we expect that most of the jobs in the near future will require digital skills, or the gap will increase, and we will have loss of jobs, or we will not have the necessary supply. So I think that we need to fund research, and we need to also make sure that we will create ethics for AI training and guidelines, as I said, for Europe. And I think this was actually the recommendation.
Bernd, I think one aspect of education that I saw in those recommendations is that there be some sort of human oversight, that humans be able to step in, that in an educational situation with AI. Can you elaborate on that and perhaps reassure us on that?
Well, that's a topic that is not just relevant to education. That's a general question of the level of autonomy that we would like to give to machines.
Indeed.
This is very hotly debated in some applications, such as autonomous weaponry, whether there always has to be a human who, in the end, is responsible for pulling the trigger.
That's right.
But of course, similar questions arise in educational environments as well. So would we want to leave grading, marking of exams, for example, to machines? Now, at this point, I think that there's a general agreement that no, we wouldn't. No, the machines are probably not reliable enough. But even if they were, assessing the quality of other people's outputs is something that we typically see as a very human activity. So this is something where I think there would not be a lot of appetite in the public to lead this to an algorithm.
Okay, what about predictive policing? Eva, is there anything you could add on that? Has your committee looked at predictive policing?
Well, we are about to have like specific discussions on any aspect that could be of great concern. And yes, we did. It has to do with like profiling
Yeah.
citizens and mass surveillance. So these are like all meanings that we have to connect and understand what the implications should be. So during the contact tracing applications, we had like a huge discussion about how to compromise privacy for safety. And we decided we don't need to do that. We need to find ways to balance the two. So we need to be able to have safety and privacy. In the same way, we need to have like safety without predictive policing. What we can do if we need to achieve this trustworthy environment and human-centric AI is to be able to use the technologies to complement what we already do. And I do believe that it's very important to understand that if you have software and hardware that you give them complete full automation, since we are humans, mistakes will happen because these AI systems are created by humans. They need to have a human oversight. So I do believe that we're going to have a balanced approach in the end, and we will not go do anything like 100%. We'll try to have it complementary to benefit citizens and to make sure we will use all these tools to achieve a more fair and trusted environment, and not to create a Netflix Black Mirror country. And we've seen how more authoritarian regimes are using technologies to achieve that, and we don't want to see that in Europe.
Yes, indeed. That raises to me another question about export of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. I know there's a debate about within the defense establishment and defense industries. Killer robots is sort of an easy term, but about autonomous systems, not only creating them here, but also exporting them. How do you control that, Bernd?
Well, we already have export control restrictions for certain types of materials, so you can't just export any sort of weaponry you would like. But of course, that doesn't necessarily really address the issue. I think that there is sort of the bigger question in the first instance, do we want autonomous weaponry at all? And there's a large international community that is trying to stop them, to ban them, similar to the way landmines are banned. But then I think that that's a political question as to whether the EU, whether individual member states would like to see this sort of weapon develop, whether they would like to deploy those weapons. And then the question of what do we do with those weapons as a follow-on? Do we sell them on internationally? Who would we sell them on? I again think these are political questions that are not fundamentally different to, let's say, selling battle tanks to other countries. I think the sort of the moral lines of debate are very similar.
Eva, did you want to weigh in on that? I mean, that is a very difficult issue, really, to deal with, because also we could have Europe could have adversaries who do use that, and then what do? You have to be ready for that, right?
Exactly. I actually had an amendment into the InvestEU file where I was saying like we should not be allowed to export technology that could in the end against a European member state. So we need to have stricter control and criteria. So you could have like exports of the hardware, but you have to have full control of the electronic systems, especially when we see member states being able to do their own agreements. And I think this is an issue that we have to address, because there is no European defense policy yet. Actually, each member state is making agreements to export. Of course, they have to pass through the European Union. They have to inform and they have to be transparent about it. But we have to expand those to the meaning and to cover also AI, have complete autonomous weapons and losing control of this technology. I do believe we will find a consensus soon, and that's why we need to work with global organizations, because these technologies, like once it's out there, it's very difficult to restrict it by physical borders.
Indeed. We only have a few minutes left here. Can we touch on warfare, disabling a power plant, for instance? Bernd, that was one of the scenarios that you saw. What do we do about that?
So the reason why we put this in the scenario and why we think it's interesting is that artificial intelligence and autonomous systems may raise new types of vulnerabilities which we're currently not well prepared for. So the worry that adversarial actors would try to take over critical national infrastructure is not new at all, right? So we've always worried that somebody might try to take down a nuclear power plant or similar things. The question is whether AI and related systems, whether they create new vulnerabilities, what those vulnerabilities are, and how we would make sure that they cannot be exploited by such adversaries. And I think the interesting point is that, well, at the moment, I think a lot of national infrastructure is built on fairly simple technical systems, nothing as complex as AI systems. But if we integrate such systems into critical infrastructure, then the question is how can we harden it? And I think that is, to a large extent, that's an open question because we're still in the process of understanding what new vulnerabilities might be and how that would play out in practice. So it's a key issue that needs to be addressed, but I think technically and practically, this is something that needs to come along in the near future.
Indeed, there have been countless sci-fi horror films based on that. Eva, I guess that is it's possible, right? How do you deal with that? What's the Parliament thinking right now?
December for critical infrastructure.
Critical infrastructure. Yeah, that is an issue, exactly.
Online and offline, so how we're gonna prevent critical infrastructures, exactly. Yeah. So this is coming as a legislative report by December, and we're gonna work on that, mention energy grid or like water supply. And also our online exposure, not just the online, but also offline security of critical infrastructures.
Right. Eva Kaili, Belchtal, thank you so much for joining us on this very, very difficult issue. And stay tuned for the developments in the European Parliament as well as the European Commission on how to deal with that. And on a global level, we have to look at how to coordinate efforts as well now that the genie is out of the bottle. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for watching the European Business Summit. We'll stay tuned for the next séance.